Hi everyone, welcome to the lesson. In this lesson, we're going to take a closer look at early civilizations in Rome. Now you might be familiar with ancient Rome, and you might be confused because sometimes you hear people talk about the Roman Republic, sometimes you might hear them talk about the Roman Empire, and you might wonder, is there a difference between the two? And in this lesson, we're going to clarify that difference by answering the question, why did Rome change from a republic to an empire? We have three goals for this lesson. Our first goal is to describe how geography shaped the Roman civilization. Next, we want to explain how the Roman Republic was a model for the U.S. government. And finally, we'll explain how Rome changed from a republic to an empire. Now, in order to meet these goals and answer our lesson question, we'll want to keep our key words in mind. These vocabulary words will come up throughout the lesson, so it's a good idea to take a look at them now in the glossary and maybe jot down some definitions in your own words in your e-notes. The words are orator, foundation myth, Pax Romana, peninsula, and republic. Our lesson question, why did Rome change from a republic to an empire, requires us to look at a few different factors. In this lesson, we're going to look at geographic influences. Then we're going to talk about the Roman Republic, and finally we're going to look at how the Roman Republic became the Roman Empire. Since both the Roman Republic and the subsequent Roman Empire were built around the city of Rome, we're going to take a moment to learn a little bit more about the history of that city. Now, we're going to begin by taking a look at what we call the foundational myth of Rome, which is basically a folklore about a society. So the foundational myth about Rome tells us the story of twin brothers, Romulus and Remus. Now, according to the legend, Romulus and Remus's father was Mars, the god of war. But Mars didn't raise them. Instead, the twins were raised by a wolf. And we're looking at sculptures of Romulus and Remus and the wolf that raised them in the image here. Now, again, according to this legend, they grew up to be warriors who built the city of Rome. Eventually, these brothers begin to fight over the city and who was going to lead the city. And that fight escalates to the point that Romulus kills Remus. And as the victor, he decides to name the city after himself. Now, this is the foundational myth about Rome. Let's take a look at the real history of this city. Our lesson question is, why did Rome change from a republic to an empire? We took a moment to look at the foundation myth of the city of Rome, and it gave us an understanding of just how long the history is, and perhaps how complicated and intense that history is as well, that fight between Romulus and Remus over this really precious city that so many people revered. Now we're going to take a closer look and a more in-depth look at how historians see the evolution of the city of Rome and the republic that eventually became an empire. We're going to begin by taking a look at the geographic influences that actually made Rome go from being kind of a city within a small geographic area and explode into a really powerful, large civilization. So let's do that now. Let's take a look at the area that made up the Roman Empire. First of all, you should know that an empire is basically a group of regions or countries that are all inclusive in one territory. And so we can think of an empire, if we want to use an analogy, like pizza. So if we draw our pizza here, the pizza is all one thing, but within that pizza are going to be a bunch of smaller, separate things. And that's what an empire is. So when we look at this map of the Roman Empire, what we're looking at are several different places. And today, these places make up parts of Europe, so we see here, parts of Africa that we see here, and parts of the Middle East. So the Roman Empire is actually really huge. And its center point is the city of Rome, which is located in Italy. And it's important to note, and you might be familiar through previous studies of ancient history of the ancient Greeks, and Greece is located very close to the Roman Empire. So we're going to focus on Italy first and foremost, because this becomes kind of the center point of the Roman Empire, and the geography of the country has a whole lot to do with that. So we're going to take a closer look now at Italy directly, and we see that Rome, this center point of the empire right in the middle of the country, is ultimately protected by the Italian geography because, first of all, it was located on a peninsula, which essentially means that it's land that's covered by water on three sides. And it's also surrounded by hills and mountains, and we see those here. So the Alps, which are mostly in Switzerland, and then, of course, some mountain ranges in the country. And then the city is located right on this area here, the Tiber River. Now, Rome actually comes at the point on the river where the river is at its most narrow. And this actually helped influence trade. Obviously, it allowed a connection to a fresh water source, and there was plenty of farmland around the city as well. And so all of these things made Rome the prime place to be the center point of this growing empire. Now, before we move on, we're going to take a moment to review what you've learned about Rome so far. What was perhaps most important to the growth of the Roman Empire was Rome's geography. Now, the geography made Rome kind of a center of trade, and trade we have to think of as being more than just trading goods and actual tangible things, but also trading ideas. So we're looking at trade and the spread of ideas, and that's happening in Rome for a few different reasons. Now, geographically, Rome is located on the Tiber River, so we see that river kind of going down in this region here, which not only provides access to the sea for the city, which is right on the ocean, but as well, the river is very wide at most points and therefore difficult to cross. So imagine if you're on either side of the river, the only way to get to the other side is to go down to Rome, where the river is narrow enough to cross over. So Rome is literally a crossroads for that river. As well, the area is going to have very good farmland all around the city, and an abundance of natural resources, which is going to, again, influence that trade, because regions that don't have that same type of access to farmland and resources are going to want to trade with Rome for those things. And then finally, the proximity to Greece. So Greece is just on the other side of the Adriatic Sea, and that proximity to Greece made Rome heavily influenced by Greek culture. So again, those ideas are going to be spreading amongst these regions. Now, as the empire is growing, so is these opportunities for trade. And what we're going to look at next is exactly how that trade is happening. So we've kind of expanded out of our map here, and now we're looking at a map that includes much of Europe, Africa, and even parts of the Middle East, which kind of begins right in this region here. And so we're looking at inclusively all of the Roman Empire. All of the green regions are part of the Roman Empire. So you could see parts of Africa, the Middle East, and even England are included in that empire. And then the purple lines show us those trade routes. So you can see that Rome's position as not only being on the water, but also being a peninsula, having water on all sides, basically makes it that prime location, because again, the only way to move these goods is by boats at this time. And so these boats are going all over the water, taking us around Europe, northern Africa, parts of the Middle East, and that's allowing the empire to not only trade, but to expand. So again, even though many of these places are independent and have their own culture, they're all included in that Roman Empire that's growing not only in strength and power, but is also influencing its regions through the trade and the spread of new ideas. Our lesson question is, why did Rome change from a republic to an empire? In order to answer that question, we needed to first look at what exactly made Rome so powerful. And what really made Rome powerful were those geographic influences that we just had a chance to talk about. Now let's talk a little bit about the Roman Republic, which came before the Roman Empire. Let's talk a little bit about the Roman Republic. Rome became a republic in 509 BCE. And a republic, first of all, is a government that's run by representatives of a country's citizens. Now, this is an idea that actually has its origins in ancient Greece. So again, we see that influence of the Greek ideas on Roman culture, but it's also an idea that you might be familiar with because the United States government, a lot of those original ideas were kind of based out of the ancient Greek and the ancient Roman practices. Now, on the screen here, we're looking at an image of a flag that has the letters SPQR on it. Now, this stands for the Senate and the Roman people. And what we're going to do next is take a closer look at exactly who it was who made up these Roman people in the Roman Republic. So let's compare and contrast the Roman social classes, which at the time were made up of two classes of people, the patricians and the plebeians. Now, both classes included Roman citizens, but what really made them different is kind of where they stood in the social standing. So the patricians were wealthy nobles, whereas the plebeians were merchants, farmers, artisans, and laborers. As a result of kind of this social difference, patricians elected members to the Senate, and the plebeians elected chosen representatives that they called tribunes. And it might seem on paper that because they're both electing representatives and they're both considered citizens, that they have kind of equal power over this representative government. But the truth is, in practice, it was the patricians that really had most of the power and most of the voice. And as a result, the plebeians would kind of protest and demand reform. And ultimately, they demanded a written set of laws that would become known as the 12 Tables. And what we're going to do now is take a closer look at those tables. Now, this written code of laws, the 12 Tables, unfortunately, there are no copies that exist today. So what historians know about the 12 Tables is very limited, but what they do know is that they were engraved on bronze tablets and posted in public areas so that everyone had access to these laws, and they allowed citizens to understand their rights and their duties. Now, one of the laws that's written on these tables is a person who had been found guilty of giving false witness shall be hurled down from the Tarpeian rock. Now, giving false witness, this is to lie in court. You might also know this as perjury. And if this sounds familiar to you, it's because we in the United States have been influenced very heavily by a lot of these Roman Republic ideas like the 12 Tables. Our Bill of Rights was heavily influenced. However, we're not hurling anyone down from big cliffs, which is what that Tarpeian rock was. So the fate that you found if you lied in court was pretty dismal. Let's take a moment now to review what we've learned about the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic's government is going to be made up of the legal code that we just talked about, the 12 Tables, but it's also going to include three separate branches of government: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Let's take a closer look at these branches, beginning with the executive branch. The executive branch includes two consuls, and until 367 BCE, those consuls were only made up of patricians, members of that wealthier class. Now, during times of war, it should be noted that the consuls were often made up of military leaders. The legislative branch is going to have a direct hand in the development of the executive branch because the electors of the consuls are members of the assemblies. And we see that the members of the assemblies are the plebeians, the kind of lower social standing classes. And interestingly, we see that that influence of protest and reform by those plebeians demanding a written code of laws and demanding a larger voice in government is going to give them the ability to influence the executive branch. Now, the legislative branch is not only made up of the assemblies, but it's also made up of the Senate, which includes those patricians. Both the Senate and the Assembly is going to include members that serve for life and is often going to be made up of soldiers. Now, that judicial branch, the final branch that we're going to talk about, included 8 praetors, and those praetors were also elected by the Assembly. So we see the Assembly is going to have a huge hand in the development of government. Now, those praetors, we might also call them judges, and they're going to serve 1-year term. Now, if any of this sounds familiar to you, it's because a lot of the U.S. government was modeled on this system of government by the Roman Republic. Let's take a closer look at how these two government systems kind of compare to one another. So in both the Roman Republic and the U.S. government, we're looking at an executive branch, a legislative branch, a judicial branch, and a legal code. But where the differences lie in exactly how these branches in this code is developed. In the executive branch in the Roman Republic, we know we've got the 2 consuls. In the U.S. government, we've got a president. In the legislative branch of the Roman Republic, we do have 2 houses, the Senate and the Assembly. And in the U.S. government, we have 2 houses as well, but we call it the Senate and the House. The judicial branch in the Roman Republic is made up of these 8 praetors, or judges, and in the U.S. government, we see that we're going to have justices or judges, but the numbers are going to be a little different, 9 instead of 8, perhaps to prevent any type of tie when there's a disagreement between the justices. And then finally, the legal code of the Roman Republic we know is the 12 tables. The legal code of the U.S. government is the Constitution. So we see some pretty intense similarities, but as well some differences. Let's take a moment to review now. Why did Rome change from a republic to an empire? As we explore this lesson question, we had a chance to look at the geographic influences that made Rome such a powerful center of a growing society. We also just had a chance to discuss the influence of the Roman Republic, not only on the growth of Rome, which would eventually become an empire, but on later societies like the United States. Now let's take some time to look more closely at the Roman Empire. By 300 BCE, the Roman Republic was looking to expand its territory. Now, in the map on the screen here, we're looking at the territory that made up the Roman Republic going into the First Punic War in 264 BCE. And in that war, Rome is going to defeat Carthage and ultimately take control of the Mediterranean. So all of this purple region makes up the Carthaginian Empire, and once Rome defeats Carthage, it's going to take control of that region as well. Now, over the next several hundred years, the Roman Republic is going to continue to expand, eventually kind of becoming that Roman Empire. But what are the implications of that expansion and growth? Well, let's take a closer look by using a graphic organizer to understand the causes and effects of the Roman expansion. So Rome is going to expand, and there are going to be a couple of effects of that expansion. One, we're going to see an increase in economic problems. We're going to see a widening gap between the rich and the poor, and that's going to lead to a lot of discontent and ultimately conflict. On the other side, we're going to see generals that are winning these battles and helping the Roman Empire expand. Those generals are going to become more influential, and as a result of their new influence, we're going to see new effects, which is soldiers becoming more loyal to their leaders, and armies are starting to be used now for personal gain. Now, the reason this is happening is because soldiers are spending more time with their generals. The generals are the ones that are actually paying them, so their loyalty is not only emotional, but it's also financial. And then as generals become more influential, they see new opportunities to use their armies for their own personal gains. So you can imagine, as your power expands and the region that your empire includes expands, it's going to be a lot harder to control that empire. And as a result of both of these effects, both the economic effects and the military effects, we're going to see conflict become a huge issue in the growth of the Roman Empire. The figure that historians associate with the transition of Rome from a republic to an empire is Julius Caesar. Now, Julius Caesar was considered a brilliant military general, writer, and orator, or public speaker. He did serve in that executive branch as a consul, and in this capacity, he was a military leader. And as a military leader, he captured vast new lands for Rome, which gained him a lot of popularity with the Roman people. But it made him a threat to many of his political rivals and other people that were in the legislative branch and were maybe looking forward to finding power of their own. Ultimately, his threat is going to lead to his assassination, and we're going to talk a little bit about how his assassination kind of marks that point where the Roman Republic ends and the Roman Empire begins. So let's take a closer look at the events leading up to Caesar's assassination. Now, Caesar, as a military leader, is growing the Roman Republic, expanding it as far as Britain, and this is going to get him a lot of support by his army and the plebeians, but it's going to make him be seen as a threat to the Senate. And the Senate basically tells him to kind of slow down, let go of some of his power, and Caesar's unwilling to do that. As a matter of fact, he even begins to lead his army, and remember, we talked about how one of the effects of this growing republic was that military generals began to use the military for their own personal gain, and so Caesar takes the army into Rome. Ultimately, this refusal to let go of power is going to lead to a civil war. And Caesar is going to find himself, through his supporters, named dictator for life. Now, this is something that was very, very unusual. This is a title that previously had only been given to someone for 6 months. So the fear here was that this could potentially become a monarchy. And for a lot of people, this was really scary because we had a government established representative system for so long, and people did not want to go in that direction. And so as a result, many of his political rivals plotted his assassination, where dozens of senators took part, even people that he had seen as allies previously. Now, following the assassination of Caesar, the civil war erupts, and once that's over, Caesar Augustus becomes the emperor, and that leads to the end of the Roman Republic. So let's take a look at Caesar Augustus's rule. Now, Caesar Augustus is going to oversee the beginning of the Roman Empire, which we could see existed from 27 BCE to 476 CE, which is about 500 years. Now, not only does his rule mark the beginning of the Roman Empire, but it also is going to begin the period that historians call the Pax Romana, or the Golden Age of the Roman Empire. And whenever we're talking about a golden age, we're talking about a time of prosperity and peace and abundance of wealth and new discoveries. And this period went on from 27 BCE to about 180 CE. So it was actually a pretty long period. And you can see that by 117 CE, the Roman Empire had expanded to include most of Europe, much of northern Africa, and then even a lot of the Middle East. So that empire, that republic that once had just been kind of Italy, has now expanded to include many other regions. Now, part of the Pax Romana were these many achievements of this golden age. And so we're going to talk a little bit about these advancements, which included a civil service system. This was basically a way to make the government more efficient. Things like improving infrastructure, bridges, roads, schools, providing kind of a basis for civil interactions, so what citizens are responsible for, but also what citizens are protected by. coins were minted to make trade easier. And so we're looking here at two coins that were discovered from around 193 CE. And some of these coins were even discovered as far away as England. So we know that this trade was really developed, and this allows trade to be a lot easier and kind of a lot more centralized because all the money's coming from the same place. As well, there were great advancements in technology, art, and literature. Let's take a look at a timeline. Timelines are really great ways to help us visualize major historic events and get an idea of how they kind of fall in line with one another. And so this is a timeline of the Roman civilization, so it includes both the Republic and the Empire and some of those major events that we talked about in the lesson. Beginning in 509 BCE, Rome is going to become a republic, and within 50 years of becoming a republic, the 12 tablets, right, that legal code, is going to be established. Now, the Roman Republic begins to expand following Rome's victory over Carthage in the Punic Wars. And by 44 BCE, we're going to see the end of the Roman Republic when Julius Caesar is assassinated. And at that point, Caesar Augustus becomes the emperor, and thus the Roman Empire begins. Now, that Roman Empire is going to go on from 27 BCE to 476 CE. And we want to remember that from the time the empire began till about 180 CE, this is that period that we call Pax Romana, or the Golden Age. So we'll just mark that that's about 180. Now, in context with other historic events of the same period, we can see that a couple other things are happening. Namely, somebody you might be familiar with, Alexander the Great, is beginning his conquest of Persia, and he would become known as one of the greatest military leaders of all time. And he's doing all of that in 334 BCE, so it gives you an idea of kind of how that measures historically with the Roman Republic. And then kind of right in the middle, or kind of towards the middle end of the Roman Empire, an emperor, Diocletian, is going to ultimately divide that empire. Now let's take a moment now to go back to our lesson question.